Welcome to the VLV's Autumn Conference. Good to see so many of you here, and I think we've got a pretty full programme coming up. I'm Colin Brown, I'm Chairman of the VLV, and it's delightful, as I say, to see so many of you here. I think most people here will know about the VLV. We are a charity. We support quality and diversity in broadcasting, and we're primarily funded by our members, but we'll also have to be very grateful towards our other sponsors, and in particular, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, who have been generous in their grants to us. Now, moving on to today, the programme, biogs, etc., can all be accessed online, and health and safety announcements always have to do this. Fire exits and collect in front of the courtyard of the Royal Academy in the hopefully unlikely event of a fire. So, to the first session. Delighted that Jonathan Munro, BBC News Global Director and Director of the World Service, is here. And equally delighted that Fran Unsworth is here as her chair of that session. Fran, of course, was herself the Chief Executive of BBC News and the World Service before that, after a long and distinguished career in the BBC. So welcome to you both, and Fran, over to you to introduce Jonathan more fully.
Thank you very much, Colin. Delighted to be here. And there seems to be, I think, a lot of interest in the World Service at the moment, possibly with the new government. So it's a very timely moment to be talking to Jonathan, whose title is BBC News Global Director. Jonathan is, of course, also the Deputy Director of News. He's fairly recently taken on the role, I think it was September. So we'd be very interested in hearing what his plans are for the future, the challenges that he faces in this role, both from a budgetary perspective, but also how the BBC can possibly continue to compete in the international news space. And I think because he's Deputy Director of News, we can also stray into slightly wider areas, which are very much in the news this week. I'm referring to the further loss of BBC talent and why this is happening and whether it's becoming a crisis or not. And as Colin said, this job that Jonathan's doing is one that I used to do myself some years ago. So forgive me if it all becomes a bit too sort of descent into three-letter acronyms, because I know what he's talking about. But so if you don't, then please shout. First of all, though, let's have a look at what we say in the business is a sizzle reel of the BBC's international offerings.
A news service with a massive weekly audience, with global coverage from regional bureau, telling more stories than any other provider.
This is the BBC World Service.
Édition de BBC Info.
In an instant. We reach into people's lives, clarifying and adding context.
The conflict between Israel and Hamas is playing out in the palm of our hands,
giving a wider perspective on what matters to them.
जब भारतीय अंतरिक्ष अनुसंधान के प्रमुख एस सोमनाथ ने चंद्रयान 3 के सफल लैंडिंग की आधिकारिक घोषणा की.
People are worried. They are waiting for help and assistance to reach them.
Наступного місяця у листопаді влада посилює репресії.
Groundbreaking stories.
But the traumas these children have gone through as a result of the earthquake will need to be treated.
We have to do a campaign even with our bulletproof vest.
Courageous journalism.
Traffickers are operating in plain sight.
Keeping the whole world connected. 24 hours a day.
The scenes are absolutely breathtaking, but it's also what we can't convey. It's the dust and the stench.
These aspiring cricketers are watching the first game of the Men's World Cup, cheering for both England and New Zealand with an equal amount of enthusiasm.
We are the BBC World Service.
So, Can I start off, Jonathan, by asking you what exactly your responsibilities encompass, first of all?
Sure. So taking what you might call the day job, first of all, the global director job, the World Service is a phrase we use for two different things that overlap. One is the World Service radio or audio stream that people will be familiar with. It actually also streams in the UK on BBC Sounds. It is what we now call a linear service in English, although it has a lot of products that arrive in people's smartphones and so on through podcasts, etc. The World Service is also the umbrella term we use for all of our international services for non-UK audiences. So, as you've just seen on the sizzle reel, that's 42 language services not in English. And they vary from really big services, the biggest of them is Arabic, to really small services, Thai and Vietnamese and Igbo being three of the smallest, for example. And then also in the World Service Group is a separate business unit called BBC Monitoring, which looks at news events and the governance of nations on earth through the eyes of the local relevant media and monitors the media. So all of that is in the umbrella World Service Group, which comes under my domain. And then also adjacent to that and working very closely, we've got the BBC News channel, which is now, as people in this room may well know, a single channel for global and domestic audiences with opt-outs for the UK on UK stories. So the global distribution of that comes under my remit, and so does the global distribution of the online news offer, bbc.com/news. That's the global director job. And then I'm also, as you mentioned, the deputy CEO of the whole of News and Current Affairs. So at one level, that's deputising for the CEO, as deputies do, obviously. But it's also being involved in quite a lot of the broader strategic issues that the BBC face, and particularly BBC News and Current Affairs deal with.
Okay. I mean, first of all, can I start by asking, and it seems like a sort of obvious question, but what exactly is the point of the World Service nowadays? I mean, it was started back in the 20th century as the Empire Service, which sort of says what they were sort of trying to do then, doesn't it, a bit?
Yeah.
But, of course, we're in a sort of post-colonial world now, so why do we need it?
For the avoidance of doubt, I wasn't there when it was called the Empire Service, just in case anyone was wondering. The World Service is a treasure, and I say that not because I run it, because I've only run it for, as you said, 2.5 months. So my longevity in the World Service is not particularly advanced at this stage. But the World Service is actually the best and most recognised cultural export of the UK. And that's not our view. It's robust market surveys around the world by organisations like the British Council, for example, who look at the exports of the UK. So the Royal Family and the Premier League are pretty high up in the list, but they're not as high as the BBC. And that, of course, is through the World Service. And the point of it is obvious, I think, to anyone who treasures free, true, impartial information and news globally. And in the world right now, in round figures, about 3/4 of nations in the world do not have what we would recognise as a free media. About 1/4 do, and we're lucky enough to live and work in one of those countries that does have a free media. We can say what we want. We're independent, and some other countries have the same privilege. Most do not. So the role of the BBC World Service has evolved. Actually, it is evolving. It will always evolve. If it stops evolving, it will stagnate, like all organisations. And so the disinformation agenda, which is now really part of the discourse in many, many parts of the world, particularly on social media, is a threat to democracies all over the world because it gives people false information. But it's also an opportunity for the BBC and an opportunity actually for the UK to play a global role. And it's something that we very strongly embrace. And some of that is very urgent and very pointed misinformation about dynamic news stories. Others affect societies around the world, and, for example, the role of women around the world is a major issue in lots of societies that we broadcast into. And our audiences reflect that. We have audiences of need, we call them. I'm not actually in love with that phrase, to be honest, but people who live in parts of the world where they have no other means of getting free and fair and independent reporting. And if you look at, for example, Afghanistan, which comes and goes from the world's headlines, but let's be honest, it's probably not something most of us read and see much about day in, day out. We're aware that it's a terrible situation there, particularly for women and girls. So the opportunity to produce journalism for the people of Afghanistan is a real audience of need. And we also produce an education program for girls in Afghanistan, which we know reaches millions of people in that country. And that's something that we're actually, in the UK, we're pretty good at doing that. And The BBC is the delivery agent for that, and we're proud of that.
Okay, so I'm sure that this room full of people, because of the nature of this organisation, are probably in general sort of supporters of the World Service and its mission. But how would you explain to, Mrs. Jones in Scunthorpe why her licence fee should be funding education for girls in Afghanistan?
That is a perfectly fair challenge, and I can talk a bit about the financial structure, but I'd just like to say, first of all, that Mrs. Jones in Scunthorpe, I often talk about my next-door neighbour in our morning meetings, because my next-door neighbour is a sort of typical member of the British public, pays her licence fee, is interested in news, doesn't come to news every day of her life, but she's interested in news, and we should address our stories to her and the millions of people like her. The licence fee goes to doing all kinds of different things. Pretty much everybody in the UK gets a local radio service, they get network television, they get network radio, they get all sorts of stuff.
Well, they get a smaller local radio service than they used to.
They get a bigger local radio service than any other provider, and we've had to make some decisions about local radio, as you know, to make it less of a less costly model. But on the World Service specifically, the proportion of the licence fee is pretty small. But the truth is that our view as the BBC is that it would be fairer if Mrs. Jones didn't pay for that through the licence fee, but paid for it through taxation. And that was the model until the coalition government changed the remit of the licence fee and asked the BBC to take the World Service into licence fee. And that was agreed before my time in 2013, I think, 2012. I think it would be fairer, given that, as I've just discussed in response to your previous question, Fran, the BBC is a cultural export on behalf of the UK, and it delivers soft power to the UK. That does not say that it's not the BBC's job to prioritise soft power. It's the government's job. It's a diplomatic strategy. But we are a main delivery point of soft power. Therefore, I think it is fairer for the taxpayer to take that burden and for it to become an instrument of government spending as opposed to licence fee spending.
Okay, well, we'll get on to just the different funding streams in a moment. But just on that point, if, it was termed the drive-by shooting that Mark Thompson agreed to take on the costs of the World Service back in 2013 after pressure from David Cameron and George Osborne. But I spent a lot of time after you arguing that actually that established the World Service's independence from government. Mm-hmm. And so how do you answer that question? I used to go over the world and the Russians would say to me, I don't know why you complain about RT, you're just the same, you're funded by the government.
Well, we're partly funded by the government now, so the principles of this are tricky, aren't they? Because you're right that there is a narrative around independence if you don't receive any government funding. If we didn't receive any government funding, we wouldn't have the size of the World Service that we've currently got. The editorial independence of the BBC is not compromised by revenue stream. And it's important, if we move to a central taxation model back to it, that there is safeguards in the Royal Charter around editorial independence. That would be a very, very important point. The drive-by shooting itself may have felt like a very good idea at the time, and I don't criticise people for making decisions at the time and the circumstances they were working in. You can't recapture those circumstances now. But the truth is that the licence fee has been frozen for 2 years since then. It was under inflation for 2 further years since then. So the buying power of the licence fee has significantly reduced. And therefore, I think it was an unintended consequence, but nonetheless it was a consequence of decisions taken by successive culture secretaries about the licence fee, that the World Service just has less money to spend. So we've had to make some decisions which, candidly, I think were decisions forced on us by a squeeze in the licence fee, which we wouldn't have taken had that not been the case. For example, I mentioned BBC Arabic was the biggest language service, still is the biggest language service. It operates on television 24 hours a day. It operates digitally 24 hours a day, but we lost our Arabic radio service because of the cuts that we had to make in the previous licence fee freeze. That was not done with anything other than the best intentions, but the truth is that if you're in Gaza right now, you don't have access to digital media, and therefore the reach of some of those services have been reduced because they are licence fee funded.
So it was a mistake then?
Look, circumstances vary, don't they? You know this, and many people in the room will know this. When you're making decisions about budgets, in any given time. You have to take the best analysis of the landscape that you're working in at that time and the priorities you're working in at that time. And nobody could know then that there would be this incredible story, a tragic story in every way, triggered from October the 7th onwards in the Middle East. But the truth is that people who were listening to us on Arabic radio are finding that more difficult. We have put in some what we call lifeline output on audio back into the Arabic language, and we are getting audiences for that. But I think we have learnt a lesson here, and it's an important lesson, that the digital maturity of markets around the world is not uniform. We have to tread quite carefully in moving audiences from linear, radio and television, into digital. In some parts of the world, that is not a difficult job. There's a lot of digital maturity in many, many markets, and a lot of our language services are digital only, but that's not the case everywhere.
So just briefly, could you just outline for the benefit of the audience actually how much money you've got and where it comes from?
Well, the timing of this conference is really interesting because yesterday, in the small print of parliamentary proceedings, the Foreign Secretary went public with figures that had until then been private, so I'm really happy to share them. And if you haven't read your parliamentary reports this morning, this may be breaking news for you. In the current financial year, the year that ends this coming April, the government paid £104 million to the World Service, which is, in round figures, just under a quarter of our costs. And yesterday, the government went public with a confirmation that that's gone from 104 to 137 million in the following financial year, so the financial year that begins April 25. It's a one-year settlement. It's only a one-year settlement because, to be fair to the government, they're brand new in, as you all know, and they wanted to do a one-year settlement, and then there'll be a longer-term settlement after that, hopefully. So it's gone up from just over a quarter of our funding to about a third.
Okay, and the rest of it is from the licence fee?
Yes, almost all the rest of it's from the licence fee. There is some commercial activity in the BBC output outside the UK. You'll know that we're not allowed to commercialise activity in the UK. That's the privilege of having the licence fee, means that you can't then compete for commercial income in the UK. But non-UK products like the .com website, for example, does have a small amount of commercial activity, but the lion's share of the rest of it is licence fee.
So just picking up what you were saying earlier, are you hoping then, is the BBC hoping, that the government will pick up the whole of the World Service's costs eventually?
With guardrails to make sure that we can properly say that the BBC is politically independent. That's a very important caveat. We can't be subject to political interference. I don't detect that anyone at Westminster thinks otherwise, but of course that negotiation is important, and the details of the Royal Charter, which expires in 2027, and that's the operating licence effectively for the BBC. It's currently an 11-year charter, and that's coming towards the end of its life. So with those caveats, we think that overall will be a better outcome.
You see, I think it's a bit of a moot point whether the World Service is safer in the government's hands or in the BBC's hands. And I think that that's something for the director to think about, because the World Service had gone through significant cuts before it came into the licence fee imposed on it by the government, and it seems to have undergone significant cuts under the BBC as well. So which do you think is ultimately better in the long term from the point of view of the budget protection?
Well, I think there are two things we really want to achieve here. The first is we want to achieve growth. And that is, you can measure growth in 100 different ways, of course, but one of the ways you grow it is, you measure it is in the number of people who are consuming BBC journalism around the world. We saw a figure on that sizzle reel of 320 million. Actually, that is the figure of the World Service, as in the English World Service, the language services and monitoring. If you then add on .com and the channel, it's about 415 million. So that's actually the figure of people around the world who are coming to BBC journalism, and that makes us the biggest player by far. The second thing we're trying to achieve is stability of funding. Now, no funding settlement, whether it's licence fee or central government funding, lasts forever. There's always a review point. There's always a moment where you have to go back and make your case for funding of any flavour. But on the independence point, the licence fee only picked up the World Service in 2014, so it's only 10 years. The World Service has been going nearly 100 years. So for the vast majority of the time the World Service has been doing its job, it has been in central government funding. And I don't personally have a principled objection with either licence fee or taxpayer funding. I just want security. I want room to grow the World Service, and the political independence is obviously important.
Okay, so let's come on to the audiences then. And you talked about 415 for the global audience measure. This is weekly. You say you're reaching 450.
That's right.
Yeah. So, what are they? Is it like they turn on Radio 4 in the morning and listen to it all day, or is it just that they, or Times Radio or whatever, or is it that actually they dip in for a few minutes a day?
Well, it can be both or either. Audiences behave in different ways in different parts of the world. So if you look, for example, there was a lot of turbulence earlier this year in Bangladesh, and we saw our service in Bangladesh double its audience pretty much overnight. So people do come to it in peaks and troughs according to events. So the 415 million is an average over the year. It can go up and down like any average. It can obviously go up and down around that figure. We do have a lot of what you might call loyal listeners, particularly to radio. Radio is the biggest delivery platform, even though digital is spoken about a lot. In fact, digital's dropped in audience reach in the last year because Facebook, in particular, have moved away from news as being part of their algorithm to most consumers, and that's been difficult for digital delivery. But radio is still extremely resilient.
So does that impact your strategy then? Do you think that you might do more radio?
I think it has an effect on whether we want to rely on third-party delivery platforms quite so much. Now, there are some third-party delivery platforms that are incredibly effective, YouTube being a very good example. In some languages, YouTube is easily our biggest delivery platform. But Facebook was doing very good numbers for the BBC, and it was particularly effective at reaching female members of the audience. So that is a challenge for all media. About a third of our audience is female. That's not enough. And Facebook was a more effective platform than YouTube for reaching women, and there are all sorts of societal reasons for that. But actually, radio reaches more women than any other platform because there are societies around the world where access to data and devices is not as available for female consumers as for male consumers. We can't fix those societal problems ourselves, so we need to reach our audiences elsewhere. So I'm a big believer in radio. I think radio is the most resilient platform, and if you're in a crisis in life, whether you're in Kabul or Beirut or Gaza, the chances are the one device you've probably got is a radio and a battery to power it, and that is a very powerful delivery method.
And can you explain how you arrive at this 415 million figure?
Yes, so there's an industry norm here. So all of the sort of big players in global provision use this thing called a GAM, which is a three-letter acronym that you warned us against earlier, Global Audience Measure. And it's an accumulation of different data. So digital data is relatively easy to harvest because you can tell when someone's visiting your website or using your services on, say, YouTube. That's simply a tally of users. Radio and television varies market by market. So some markets have what we have in this country. We have a ratings regime that you will all know about, and no doubt you follow closely, of who's watching what, and where we have that, we'll add that in. There are other markets where it's more difficult to do that, and we use sampling to get our market data. And then we report back. And now, of course, for most organizations, that's about commercial eyeballs. How many people are watching CNN or other... CNN on the phone, I think, with their latest global audience measure, because they need that for advertisers. Well, that's not our space. We don't need it for advertisers, despite the fact I mentioned commercial activity earlier. It's not our main driver. But it is important, I think, for people who pay the license fee or the tax to know that we're reaching significant numbers of people with that, because that's a value for money point. So 415 million or thereabouts. No one will ever say to you that is an absolutely bang-on, crystal clear, to the penny point accurate measure. But it's the best the industry's got. And there's one other little nuance. We report that weekly, because it's an important target for us to reach people on a very regular basis. A lot of other organisations report those monthly, so their reach looks higher than it is compared to ours. So we're quite proud of our reach. It's not far shy of 500 million people. We'd like it to be even higher.
Okay. I said at the outset, there seems to be quite a bit of, you ride in the crest of a wave, I feel, in your sort of new role, because I do think there appears to be quite a lot of interest in the World Service from the new Parliament, particularly, there are all these reviews going on. You've talked about soft power, and answer the question I was going to ask about how you feel a bit about being burnishing, the BBC being used to burnish Britain's image abroad. But do you actually think this is going to translate into any more money?
Well, you know, we've got, as I just mentioned, the funding settlement I just outlined is a one-year settlement. There's then 2 more years before the Royal Charter is renewed. So we've sort of got a 2-year period in financial year beginning 26 and the financial year beginning 27 when we're under the existing charter, but we're negotiating a new one. One of our challenges here is that the charter is held by the DCMS. The World Service is held by the Foreign Office as a government responsibility. The Treasury's obviously got oversight of all financial issues. So navigating different government departments is a challenge, not just for the BBC, obviously, but for lots of organisations who have relationships with government. As you've just mentioned, we've got 3 different select committee investigations going on at the moment, inquiries going on at the moment. The Foreign Office Select Committee, the Development Select Committee and the Culture Select Committee. I think they are genuinely designed to be helpful, and you mentioned the crest of the wave point, which obviously implies the wave is going to come crashing down to the beach at any moment. I think there's a number of reasons why that is the case, why there is a moment now of quite heightened interest in the World Service. One is the new government, and they've brought in, like any department of state, when it changes hands, there's a different feel to foreign policy, and we talked about soft power earlier, and we are, as I mentioned earlier, not aligned in terms. It's not our job to deliver it, but we are very much a key point of delivery of soft power. Secondly, you may have noticed there's a huge number of new MPs, and a lot of them are interested in the World Service, and they want to ask questions about it. They want to sit on relevant committees about it. They want to understand more about it. There's also been some pressure from Brits abroad, as it were, embassies, high commissions, whose work we, again, are quite aligned with, even though we have different priorities, talking to Foreign Office ministers, many of whom, well, all of whom are new in post, and there's been a briefing process there. And then finally, we've got in the BBC a further round of savings, which are, there's always savings at the BBC, as you know, but it's all the aftermath of the freezing the licence fee under the previous government, and that's led to a point where we want to open up the discussion about the funding of the World Service. So all of those things have sort of come in to play at roughly the same time.
So let's sort of do some sort of international comparisons, because I think I sort of estimated that probably the total budget is, around 300 million, is it?
A little bit more than that, yeah.
What are the Chinese and the Russians, though, spending on their international services?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We can't know the answer to that because they're not transparent and they don't have an annual report like we do where you put it all in the public domain. But we can have a really good guess at this. The Chinese are easily the biggest spenders, by miles. And they are spending, and this, your figure is about right, 300 to 400 million in the UK for the World Service. We think the Chinese are spending between £5 and £6 billion a year on global media outreach. And we think the Russians are spending about half that. So between them, they're spending about 8 billion. And then the Iranians are quite proactive in this space, and the Turks are getting more proactive in this space. Now, what does that mean in real life? It means that if you go to most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, on mainstream media in most countries, there is either a Russian-sponsored news outlet or a Chinese-sponsored news outlet, or both. It means that if you go to Lebanon and you tune in on your radio to the wavelength that used to be the BBC's Arabic radio service, you're now getting Russian state-sponsored media, an organisation called Sputnik. So we monitored Sputnik on the day of the walkie-talkie explosions that many of you will remember a few weeks ago. And the narrative that came out of that output was that the path to peace in the Middle East was to strengthen the ties between Middle Eastern capitals like Beirut, Cairo, Amman, and Moscow. Now, that is clearly in Russia's interest to promote that narrative. It's not a narrative that would come from an independent media source because it's not demonstrably not true. And that's what consumers are getting. So what's happening around the world is that when radio is particularly an issue here because wavelengths are actually contested. You can't just set up a radio station. In most parts of the world, you have to get on the transmitters to make that work. And where there is a gap or a space, the Russians and Chinese have become quite skilled, quite frankly, in getting in there. Fleet of foot is a good phrase for it.
So, well, given that the government are probably never going to come up with $6 billion for the World Service,
we can hope.
They might give you a bit more or whatever, but it's never going to be those kind of sums. How on earth are you thinking you might compete with that?
You know, we don't need or want $6 billion, just for the avoidance of doubt, and that's probably lots of people in the Treasury who are rather relieved to hear that. That's not the ask at all. We've got a lot of things going for us that the Russians and Chinese have not. A recognition in brand value terms about truth and impartiality is super important for lots of audiences. Secondly, we've got a brand legacy that's also very important for a lot of audiences. And thirdly, as I've just described in our reach figures, we are significantly bigger than the Chinese and the Russians globally right now. And we're doing that on the budgets we've got, not the budgets that the Chinese have got. We can't guarantee, of course, that if you keep spending at the rate the Chinese are spending, they won't encounter significant growth. They probably will. And there's only so much we can do to counter that. But one of the things we can do to counter that is not to vacate the space that allows state actors to get in. And that comes back to the point we made earlier about Arabic radio and being careful what we do in those sorts of dilemmas in the future. We've also got another advantage, which, despite the fact that we do 42 languages, our biggest single service is World Service English. And we do happen to operate in the most widely spoken language in the world. And therefore, we've got an advantage that the Russians, for example, can't match in that regard. But we are under pressure from them. And it's important to be honest about that. We've had a significant number of our staff, for example, in Abuja, who work in the Hausa language, who've been hired by the Russians to operate a Hausa language service on behalf of Sputnik. And when you're spending £2 billion a year, you can go in and afford to pay people double what they're being paid by the BBC. So these are real-life challenges. And the stress point for us, it comes back to the conversation we were having 10 minutes ago, is how much can we ask of the licence fee payer to protect our Hausa service versus how much we can ask the government to do that on behalf of the UK as opposed to on behalf of the licence fee.
Also, let's just sort of talk a bit about the audience. I mean, given that we started off saying, the World Service was the Empire Service, but it's now as needed as much as ever, independent news, free from influence of government, whatever. But given the retreat, even in Western democracies, of sort of liberal values, do you think that the World Service is going to be, the editorial offer, will be valued by audiences as much as it has been in the past? Or do they want to retreat to their own echo chambers, as we see actually is happening quite a lot over the world?
In most parts of the world, the media is becoming a more fragmented arena, and there are more things to choose from, and people have got the right to choose. If they don't have the choice of coming to the BBC, then we're underserving those audiences. And one of our challenges here is how you evolve services and how you make them feel more modern. And we're doing that all the time. We're always asking ourselves, shall we take a certain programme out and replace it with something more modern? Shall we look at refreshing an offer for whatever reason? I mentioned I was talking to the Hausa service recently in Nigeria about this raid by the Russians. But it wasn't all doom and gloom there. We do a programme there called The Gist, which is done in both English and Hausa. And we told a story about a woman, she'd be in her early 30s, I think. She volunteers to teach children in Maiduguri, which, as many of you will know, has been the scene of lots of school kidnappings, really brutal stories. So she doesn't operate in a school because the children are too frightened to go to school. She pops up in a village hall, then another village hall, then a different village hall, sort of peripatetically, telling that story in a modern way that reaches audiences on social media, on YouTube, on television, on radio and online is a way of getting to audiences which was not our custom and practice 5 years ago. We were much more focused on linear delivery and traditional delivery methods. So we have to stay relevant. We have to tell audiences stories on platforms where they are available, and we need to tell them in a way that is attractive to audiences. But I think underpinning all that, the stories that we tell, broadly speaking, have to have a public purpose. And that means that we are not into driving growth through quote-unquote clickbait. I'm not interested in the World Service, whether in English or other languages, in doing stories that have no real meaning, no real depth. They have to have purpose. We are a public purpose-based organisation. It's in the World Charter, that's what we do. And I'd rather have growth that's meaningful than growth that's empty, because you don't keep growth that's empty, they just clickbait somewhere else. And it doesn't deliver to the values of the BBC.
What about, AI? Is the World Service sort of thinking about how it might use AI to deliver some of its services in an effective way which might improve reach?
Yeah, it's the next big frontier, isn't it? And we've just discussed the range of languages we work in. Although there are 42, if you talk to the UN, they recognise, I think it's 277 primary languages around the world, so there's a long way to go. And AI could be a big assistance in that. But there are some caveats. First of all, most importantly, it's absolutely BBC policy that no AI product will ever reach the audience without human oversight. I think that is super important. Even very sophisticated AI models, at least sophisticated today, they may move on again in the next few years, but even very sophisticated ones cannot cope with the nuance of language. There's a world of difference between, in English, between the word killed, murdered, assassinated, found dead. They have different meanings. And in some AI models, all AI models have vulnerabilities if you're using them simply as translators. So we absolutely need human oversight. That is really important. Secondly, we need to be honest with audiences if we are deploying AI, and we don't currently do this in audience-facing material in the World Service. But if we get to that stage, we would always be transparent with the audiences. But I do think those caveats allow us some space to innovate. You talked about the Empire Service. Well, in those days, people would take tape and razor blades and splicing tape to put together their radio pieces, right? And
in my lifetime, actually.
Your lifetime, not that long ago. In those days, if people who were watching television were watching bits of film that took a week to develop, and it was laced through the sprockets and whatever. Technology will change, and we have, as an organisation, just like society generally, to embrace that and to look for the opportunities to make technology work in our favour. So the caveats are designed to protect us from the downsides, mitigate the risks. That's part of our job. That's what we should always do. But I don't think we should be afraid of taking some mitigated, carefully calibrated risks in the interests of developing and innovating, because in 5-10 years' time, it may well be that we are reaching significant audiences all over the world with proper values-based journalism, which has been assisted in its journey by AI. And I don't think we should be afraid of that. We just need to tread carefully.
Okay. Before I open it up to the audience for any questions, I just want to turn to your wider role as the Deputy CEO of News. And we've had a week where, another presenter, it seems like Gary Lineker is getting his revenge on the BBC by just offering every BBC presenter a podcast with Goalhanger. Is this now a crime? Michelle Hussain? It's like, really? Oh, dear. One of the BBC's top interviewers is going to the relative obscurity of Bloomberg. What have you done to make this happen?
Okay, look, I'm personally very sorry to see Michelle go. I think she's excellent. And I work with her personally very closely. I executive produced the television debates in the last general election, which she moderated, and she did a brilliant job. And you may remember that one of them in particular was at short notice because she was doing one, Sophie Rayworth was doing the other. Sophie actually broke her ankle and couldn't walk around the set, which you couldn't sit down and make that programme work. So we asked Michelle at pretty short notice to do it, and she did it with extreme skill and brilliance. And she was on air for the deaths of both the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh on radio. So, and many of you in this room will wake up with the voice of Michelle Hussein in your house in the morning. So it's a real
So how did
shame.
you lose her? Tribute's over. How did you lose her?
You know, from time to time, people want to get off what they're doing. And I have never worked on a breakfast show. I always thought it was one of the great pleasures of working at ITN, as I did for many years, that they didn't have breakfast news, because it means getting up at 3:30 in the morning. And from time to time, people do say, look, I really want to do something else. And that's perfectly understandable. There may be people in this room who like being up at 3:30 in the morning. I must say I'm not one of them. And she reached the point where she'd done 10, I think it might be now 11 years by the time she steps down in January on the Today programme and wants to do something else. The truth is that when people do that, we make efforts to see if we can find excellent other opportunities, but of course they're going to look outside. And from time to time, external organisations, which, candidly, they don't declare their salaries, we've no idea what they pay, and it'll be a significant amount of money. And there are times when the best thing for everybody is to wish people the very best of luck as they move on, and to use the opportunity to bring someone else in. I have no idea who that will be, but somebody will occupy that space, and they might be the next person who does the television debates, the next person who does the death of a monarch whenever that comes. And everybody who's in one of these jobs now is in the job because someone else previously left that role.
Fair enough. But I suppose one of the concerns, and let's hope she doesn't turn up at Bloomberg doing some programme which interviews world leaders called Hard Talk, say.
Well, somebody did ask me the other day if before she announced she was stepping down, if she was a candidate to take over from Gary Lineker on Match of the Day. I've never talked to Michelle about football, but it could have been interesting.
But it does bring up another point here, which is that are you concerned about the kind of lack of effective formats for debate in the BBC, longer form interviews, discussion? I mean, that's kind of what the loss of Hard Talk represented, wasn't it? And yes, we see that there's some very entertaining things in the podcast world, but actually it's chat. It's no replacement for something more in depth, which used to be right at the heart of what the BBC did.
I think there's some truth in that, but not entirely. If you look at, or listen to rather, some of the podcasts that you mentioned, many of them do, not all of them, but many of them do quite interrogative and important interviews. If for example, you listen to Americast, which is the BBC's offer on US politics, and obviously that's fantastically important and also very interesting right now. They've had numerous guests who are playing key roles in the Trump administration, or will be, and they're now in the transition phase. Now, the interviews are a different style from Hard Talk or Laura Kuenssberg or one of those programs that many people in this audience will know. But it doesn't mean they're not good interviews. They're actually really good interviews, and sometimes they can make more progress precisely because of their slightly more informal style. On Hard Talk itself, I have a particular angle on this because it runs on World Service English as a programme. The television programme is what people see, but the audio version of the same thing runs on World Service English 2 or 3 times a week and does get a significant range of guests. But the truth is it was made as a programme for the News Channel, as a television product. And the News Channel is moving away from built programs. Built programs is a bit of jargon, but things that are recorded in advance, they're half an hour long, you put them in on a certain slot. It's moving away from those, and there are very, very few of those left in the schedule now. And the reason for that is because audiences do not watch them. That's just the truth. They watch live news. They want live news from a channel, but audiences do not watch pre-recorded programs on news channels in any significant number. And therefore, when you're looking at the range of offer for a news channel and whether you should invest more in live news, live analysis, things like verification, which we've obviously, as people in this room will know, we've put a lot more resource into that through BBC Verify in the last 18 months or thereabouts. Things, you can't keep adding things to the portfolio and not face tougher decisions. And when the news channel's audience is behaving in that way, they're behaving in a way that says that we want a news channel for live breaking news and analysis of live breaking news, then that tells you something about the decisions that you need to make in order to fund new things. There is still plenty of analysis and interviews across the BBC, and we'll no doubt invent new formats in the future, of course.
I'm going to open it up. Do I have any questions for Jonathan from the audience? Patrick, then Julia. Wait for a microphone. And would you mind saying who you are for the benefit of the audience?
Hello, Patrick Barwise from London Business School. I'd like to talk about the 415 million, which to me is a solid number. I mean, it's industry standard and so on. But one quite often sees statements from the BBC along the lines of the BBC News has a global audience of 415 million. That's outside the UK. Now, I don't think there are many other organisations which would exclude their own market when they're talking about the global audience. You're competing against people like Facebook. Facebook at one point claimed to be reaching more UK 18 to 24s than the UK population of 18 to 24s. But the BBC, being the BBC, doesn't include the UK audience when it talks about its global news weekly reach, and doesn't, when using the 415 million figure, say outside the UK. Can I please persuade you to do one of two things? One is to say the global audience is 470 million or whatever, or to say it's 415 million outside the UK.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yeah, we should definitely be very transparent about what the audience figures do and do not include. I think I completely agree with that. I think the audience measure is an industry standard thing, so that we are doing our best to do like for like. Although, as I mentioned earlier, it's quite hard because a lot of organisations report monthly and we report weekly, and that obviously has an effect because quite a lot of audiences come to us perhaps once a month. So that it's hard, it's hard to do an apples versus apples thing on that. But I completely take your point about transparency, about what's included and excluded in those figures, and thanks for the suggestion. We'll have a look at that.
Well, also, I would go for the bigger number.
Always helpful.
Julia, next, and then the gentleman in the cap.
Thank you very much. My name's Julia Bicknell. I worked at the World Service for many years and for Fran, and just missed being the first ever producer of Hard Talk. Oh. And that's what I want to pick up with you. I hear what you say, that the TV audience wasn't there for it, but I just wonder how much you take into consideration when you make these decisions, the fact that a programme like that, which again I listen to a lot on the World Service, is a kind of a bedrock of information, research, for so many other places where people can pick up, hold their own governments to account, whatever. I know that people have, used those interviews of presidents, prime ministers, senior figures of all sorts to then challenge, maybe, charged with corruption, whatever it might be. And I'm just curious that a TV decision, and let's face it, maybe lots of people don't sit and watch a half-hour television interview. They do like me. You don't need to see the person sitting in the chair. You're interested in the ideas and in the challenge. I'm curious that you didn't, for instance, just let it be fun. I know why it's expensive. It's not expensive because of the actual 30 minutes or 25 minutes. It's the research, it's the time of the journalists and the production team that goes into it. And I'm just curious about how that played into your decision-making.
It's a really powerful point, and I think the ecology point, if that's the right phrase for it, that where BBC journalism sits in the ecology of calling to account and so on, is powerful. This is not, I want to be clear, this is not the end of us doing long-form interrogative interviews. We did Angela Merkel 2 days ago about her thoughts on the refugee crisis that swamped through Germany after the Syrian civil war, for example, about her thoughts on Brexit and her thoughts on Trump, because obviously she was Chancellor the first time around when Trump was President in his first term. And we not only did that, we cleared a half hour on BBC Two to make sure that the audience was maximum for that programme. And of course, iPlayer is a big help on those things now, because a lot of audiences come to those on demand. But in the decision you make about programmes coming out, when you take any programme out, you allow yourself some elbow room to create other things within the BBC. So, before my times, I'm not claiming any stake in this. There was no doubt a whole debate about whether we should take out the Sunday lunchtime political programme on BBC One, which was on the record, and you remember the crocodile thing that used to go around the Big Ben. It came out, but it allowed the BBC to do other things in terms of political programmes for the regions. So you're looking at all sorts of things in the factor of...
I was responsible for that decision.
Is that a good decision?
No. I don't think it was in retrospect.
Well.
Anyway, gentleman in the cap, and then the lady at the back there. Oh, I've got loads of hands up now.
Thank you. Andre Leon, a producer, presenter. I grew up listening to the BBC World Service from Africa in the 1960s. And there was a multiplicity of programs, and we relied on the news specifically as a source of valuable information. I think we should continue to regard the World Service as a national treasure, and indeed, perhaps even an international treasure. I also want to say, sorry, Jonathan and Fran, that mine was the first mobile phone that called you from the audience during your flow of presentation. But had it been programmed to play the Lily Bolero, I would have let it run its full course.
Thank you. The lady over there, and then the gentleman here, and the lady here after that. 1, 2, 3.
Hello, it's Anita Singh from the Daily Telegraph. You mentioned BBC Verify earlier. It's set up, I think, to fact check and to be this sort of bedrock of truth, but it's attracting its own criticism for political bias on Israel or farmers or whatever. I know a lot of BBC journalists find it quite an embarrassing idea, because shouldn't every single thing which appears in the BBC News be fact-checked and true? That should be the sort of the base for that. So why do you think that's necessary? And can you say how much it costs per year?
Look, well, first of all, we don't break down costs of individual teams in the BBC. That's just not viable. There's all sorts of resources that swim between a team and the next team and get pulled in on a story, but they don't necessarily live it. It's just not. We just don't track it in that way. So that's not an available figure. The BBC has a role in a world of misinformation and disinformation, in truthful analysis of claim and counterclaim, and everybody would accept in a organisation like all newsrooms, which are principally based on human judgments, that occasionally mistakes are made, and then they need to be corrected and rectified. That happens in every single newsroom. We are extremely keen to ensure that our processes are as robust as possible. I don't accept your premise about bias on stories. We are not biased politically, unlike other organisations which are entitled to be. We are mandated not to be, and I don't think that's a fair assessment of the work of that team, or indeed any other team, on the stories you mentioned.
Fran, can I just ask what you think of Verify, because you didn't feel the need to have it when you were in charge?
Well, I'm not really the one that's supposed to be answering the questions, but I think that if you want to set your stall out and say what you're about, it's probably a pretty good branding exercise. But my anxieties are the ones that you expressed, which is, what's he saying about the rest of the journalism? Is that not true then? But I can see what the objective is, and I think is probably broadly succeeding. Gentleman here, then the lady here.
Graham Mitten. I was in charge of audience research at World Service throughout the 80s and 90s. And I just want to support what Patrick said. And actually, we always used to give our global figures, including the GB figures. And I'm not quite sure why Claire Rooney, if Claire is now responsible. Claire Rooney, by the way, is my successor, who does a brilliant job at World Service on the audience research. But I'm going to change the story.
Sure.
When I was still there, I was telling Sam and his successors and predecessors things like, don't always talk about audience loss as a bad thing. Sometimes it's actually reflecting good news. There used to be a Portuguese service. It was very successful during the period of fascist dictatorship. There used to be a Greek service. It was very, very popular in Greece during the colonels. When the Greek service closed, almost nobody noticed because they'd stopped listening. The same with Portuguese. We used to broadcast in Italian. We used to broadcast in Spanish. All those things disappeared when those countries had a free press and dictatorships ended. So sometimes one day the Somali audience will fall off a cliff and it'll be the best news that Somalia has ever had. That's the problem you've got. Sometimes, audience loss is good news.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective. We have, of course, put new services in because there are new trouble spots in the world, and I suppose the whole point is to be fleet of foot, to borrow Fran's phrase from earlier, about launching services where there's a sudden audience need and not retaining them where the audience need goes away. It would be wonderful if no such audiences of need, I don't like that phrase, but you know what I mean, existed, because peace has broken out globally, but that might put quite a lot of journalists out of work.
Lady here.
So the BBC is trusted international. I'm Sophia Ahmed and I'm a trainee journalist at City News. The BBC is trusted internationally. My family in Kenya love it. Most people all over Africa actually rely on the BBC World Service. You obviously recognize that. But I wondered what counts for the disparity here. It's constantly under attack domestically. And every other week, in fact, yesterday, it was trending on X. Defund the BBC is always trending. So I wondered, what do you think the difference is?
Do you mean the difference between the World Service and what you might call domestic BBC?
Just trust for the BBC internationally versus...
I think you're getting at the way it's perceived abroad and the way it's perceived in the UK.
Yes.
Yeah, look, people in the UK fund the BBC and therefore they're entitled to a view about the BBC. Well, everybody's entitled to a view, but in the UK you literally have a license to have a view about the BBC because you pay for it. And no one at the BBC should be above criticism from any quarter, and that can be at times quite pointed, and that can be about news, it can be about salaries, it can be about favourite television programmes, all sorts of things. And that happens all the time. It's also the case, though, that in politics in the UK, there are some issues which are ventilated through people's reaction to the way the BBC covers a story, and that can suit the cause of the people advocating a certain case on a divisive issue. There are esteemed colleagues here from newspapers who like to put BBC stories on the front page of their publications because it suits their agenda. There's nothing wrong with any of that. It's perfectly valid and legitimate. But we live in as I said earlier, we are very privileged to live in a country where we have a free media and a free press, and we should all celebrate and acknowledge that. That does mean that there's a debate about the BBC, which is more pointed in the UK than outside the UK, because there's an awful lot more exposure of the BBC brand within the UK than outside the UK. What we do outside the UK is almost by definition less of a political issue, because it's not, we talked earlier, Fran and I were discussing, as you heard, the funding models of the BBC. Well, that is a politically contentious thing. The people in Parliament, quite understandably, quite legitimately, have different views about the funding model and indeed the level of funding that's appropriate for public service broadcasting in the public sector. There's nothing wrong with that debate. That debate doesn't play out in Kenya. It's not relevant. So there's obviously contentious issues that are about the BBC and the governance and management of the BBC, which are domestic issues.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm getting those winding up signals from the organisers, so I'm going to have to draw it to a close, although I could see there were quite a few people who still had questions to ask. So thank you very much for your interest. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you, Fran.
For being so open with us.